So we were back with lesson 6. It's part 2. We've enabled basic authentication in our bookstore. So we can register, we can log in. We've got access control to our categories controller, as well as we've added a little logic in our nav bar, so anonymous users do not even see this categories link. Let's actually go ahead. Actually, you know what? Sorry, we will come back. We're going to add our authorization check, and then we'll control access to the books section as well. And then before we go, we'll start to create the first page of our shopping cart for our public, our anonymous users, or our customers. So a couple of things we need to do to enable the authorization. So you're going to need to connect to your database in Management Studio for this. Okay. So I'm not sure is this account anybody's account in the class? I don't really think it is. I'm going to delete this account. I'm not sure where it came from. I'm just going to delete that. So I should only have one user. So what we want to do is we're manually going to create 2 roles in the database, and then we're going to assign our existing admin@gc.ca. We're going to assign that account. We're going to put them in make them a member of the administrator role. So I've got a short script on D2L that we can run in Management Studio against the database. So if you scroll down, I'll put the commands in the chat as well. They're just 3 simple insert statements that we want to run. So you can copy those, either from D2L or from the chat. So you're going to connect to your database in Management Studio. I will show you, Mason. So once you're connected, there's 2 ways you can get to the query window in Management Studio. You can right-click your database and choose New Query, and it'll open up a query tab. Or there's this New Query button right on the toolbar under your window menu. I typically just use this. I just click New Query, and then you get a query window. You should make sure your last chapter database is selected, because we want to run the commands in this database. This is like a visual way of running a use command, basically. So then just paste them into the query window. So it's going to create 2 roles. The first command is going to create a role with an ID of 1 and a name of administrator. The normalized name, we're just going to kind of ignore. It doesn't really matter, but it's a column in the table. The second insert will create a role with ID of 2 and a name of customer. And then we're going to take the existing user account that we have, and we're going to place that user into role ID 1 in this ASP.NET user roles junction table. Okay, so right now we have 1 user, but we have no roles. So that user is not in any role. So this script is designed to fix that. We're creating 2 roles, and we're making our 1 user a member of this current role. So to run the script, you can just click the Execute button on your toolbar in Management Studio. It tells me each command ran successfully. So now I could go to a new query window, and I can check my ASP.NET roles and my ASP.NET user roles table just to make sure that I can see what the data in those tables looks like now. So make a new query, You don't have to do this, but if you want to check, first I'm going to check ASP.NET roles. And now we can see I've got ID 1 was administrator and ID 2 is customer. If I also want to run the query, I want to check my ASP.NET user role, so my junction table, to make sure that that admin account has now been placed in the role of administrator. I can actually run both and I get two different query results. So my first query populates above, and now we can see that my one user account is in the role ID of 1, which is administrator. So this is the result that we want. So just paste those commands from D2L or the chat into a query window, execute the query, and you can check if you want to make sure that those queries created the data that we need. You can just run your two select statements here and make sure that you have two roles and one user role. If you need help or you have a question, please just let me know. I'll just leave this up for a moment before we move forward, in case anybody needs any help. What is that? So there's claims on both users and roles. I've never used these tables, Megan, so let's see what the columns are. I'm not even sure what we would use. So we've got a user as a foreign key and a type of claim. Let's see. I haven't used it, so I don't know. So we're going to be doing role-based security. So it's I'm just reading here. So there's two approaches to authorization: roles and claims. We're going to use roles. So an alternative, let's see what this tells us. Claim is a statement that an entity makes about itself. Claim list can have the users. So a user in role-based security, user presents credential directly to the application. In a claims-based model, the user presents the claims and not the credential. So this is sort of token-based. I'll put this link in the chat. We'll maybe have to look a little bit more. I've only ever really used role-based authentication. Got me through 2 decades. So claims-based is third-party bound. So claims are provided by your third-party application. So, for example, in a non-software, the idea of using your driver's license, for example, to go to the store and buy alcohol, that's claims-based in a sense, because you don't create the identification card. The store you're buying it doesn't have it. It's accepting this third-party claim from the province about who you are and how old you are, in a sense. So more descriptions here. So it's saying if you want to use Spotify in your own application, in effect, you'd be sending a token to validate who you were in Spotify for some other app to be able to access your library. So there's lots here. So what we want to do now that we've set up our database the way we need to, before we can actually implement our authorization check, we need another user account, but this user is going to be a customer. In fact, we want anybody else who registers on the site to automatically be put into the role of customer. So in order to do that, we are going to add customization to the code that gets executed when the user submits the register form. Now this form, it does exist in the project, but it's not actually visible, which is a little bit weird. So if we want to make any changes to the registration page, either to the HTML, like let's say you just want to change the heading, or if we want to change anything in the code, we basically have to kind of make it visible and then we can change it. So I'll show you where to find it. It's in kind of a weird place. So in Solution Explorer, we have one folder we haven't really looked at yet, which is the areas folder. So let's expand that. And in here, you'll see there's a subfolder for identity. So what we want to do is add in, we want to enable or make visible the register page, the HTML and the C# code that come with the identity framework. So how do we do that? So under areas and identity, if you just select your identity folder, and right-click, and then choose Add a new scaffolded item. I'll leave this path up for a minute so you can see. So add a new scaffolded item. And then there's a whole bunch of different MVC files. What we want is to check the identity section. Adds code required for using ASP.NET Core identity in the application. So I'm going to click the Add button. Excuse me. So it's saying which file do you want to override? The last one. We want to override, we want to make changes to the account register page. So I'm going to check on that box. It's the second last item in the third column. You can see all of the other views that come with identity. It's got things like two-factor authentication, forget password, etc. And then under the data context, we're going to pick our database connection object, the application DB context file that Visual Studio built inside our data folder. So there's only one option there. Just make sure you pick it in the drop-down list. We're using our existing database connection. So I've checked off account register, chosen our DB context, then I can just click the Add button. And when we do this, it's going to generate a copy of the register page that we can customize. It opens up this little text file, gives us some more information about customizing ASP.NET Identity with a link in this little README file. We'll just close that up. And now when I go back to Solution Explorer under Identity, Areas Identity, we now have a subfolder here that wasn't there before called Account. And under Account, you can now find the register CS.html. So this is the view file. We can open it up. Here's the registration page. So if we wanted to change any of the instructions, if we want to add additional fields to the registration form, we could. We're not going to, but we could do it here. There's also a check if we have enabled external logins in the application configuration, it will show buttons So we'll get to this in a couple weeks after reading week. We'll work with this. So we're not actually changing any of the HTML. This page can look exactly how it looks. But we're going to make two small changes in the code that runs behind it. So where's the code? These files are just called razor pages. There's no controllers or models here. So here's the view file, the register CS.html. The code that runs it is just underneath it. So if I click the little triangle beside register, it opens up another file underneath, which is register.cs.html with a .cs extension. So if I open this, this is the C# code that runs behind that view. We're not going to go through all of this. So this is a public page. It uses our identity user class, checks for external logins. So we're going to make one small change and one small addition. On line 54, these are some annotations around the password property. And so here's the validation that runs to check down below. But on line 54, you can actually see that the minimum password length by default that identity enforces is actually 6 characters. I find this kind of weird. This isn't standard or best practice. Most best practices insist that passwords should be at least 8 characters. So I'm just going to change that minimum length attribute from 6 to 8 on line 54. Totally optional. You don't have to do this. But if we're going to implement security, well, let's do it right. So our minimum length, I'm going to make it 8. Adam, you see I have this little black triangle beside register.cs.html. You just click it and the the file is underneath it. So it's kind of like hiding behind it. Here's the interface, here's the code that lives behind, which is actually very old. The original ASP.NET model in 2002, even before it had anything to do with MVC, that's how it worked. If you built login was a .aspx file. The ASPX file had all the HTML, and then there was login.aspx.vb or .cs that had all the server-side code. So every time you made a page, you actually got 2 files, an HTML file and then a server-side script file with the same name. So the code we need to add is down here. On line 71, this is the post method. So this gets called when the user clicks the register form. So we're going to leave all this code. The actual important stuff happens right here. We're checking that the validations are okay. For example, the passwords match. We've met the password rules. The user doesn't already exist in the database. If all those things are true, it creates a new identity user object with the variable name of user. So this is our new user with the email they put in. And then on line 78, this is the line that actually creates the new record in the ASP.NET users table. It will salt and hash the password. It runs an asynchronous call to send that new user account to the database. And it will return a true false Boolean. Did it succeed? If that new user account was successful, then it checks that setting we had in startup, right? And will send an email if our site is configured to send an email. We've turned that off, so none of this code actually runs. What our site does now is it comes inside this else. It basically calls sign in async. So it signs the user in right away. As soon as they create a new account, they don't have to sign in. They're automatically signed in. That's the default behavior. All this code is fine. We're just going to interrupt this with one thing. if the user registration is successful, before we do all this other stuff, you're going to automatically put any new users into the role of customer. And the role names are case sensitive in ASP.NET Identity. So if you had customer all lowercase, customer with a capital C, Identity considers those two separate things. So we're going to take this new user object and we are going to put them in the role of customer with a capital C. So we only need one simple line for this. We'll await, we'll use our user manager class, same class that we use for creating the user. And we will call add to role async. And this takes two parameters, a user object and the name of a role as a string. So who's the user? Well, this is our user object we're creating here on line 77. What role do we want to put them in as a string? We want to assign them to the role of customer. So this saves to ASP.NET user roles. So we'll use the user ID property of our new user account, and then it will fetch the ID of the customer role and automatically add them to the ASP.NET user roles table. So here's the code. And this goes inside this if results succeeded block. If the user registration failed, well, we don't want to put them in the customer role. So now we can try this out. I'm going to stay logged in as my administrator in Firefox. Now I'll go to Chrome and I'm going to create, I'll put it in the chat, but for our customer, let's use customer@gc.ca and the same password, 123 test, 123 $. Our first T is capitalized. So I'm going to register. Okay. We got an error. We got an error because there's something I forgot to do. So our user account actually got created, right? Because it died when it tried to put them in the role. If I go and check the database and look in ASP.NET users, see, my customer got created. So the user account got created, but when we tried to put them in the role, here the code died. That's okay. It says our store does not implement the user role store. So our site is not configured. It's configured to handle authentication, but role management hasn't been configured yet. So it's not there by default because there's something I neglected to do in the startup file. You'd think when I put it in my notes that I would remember, but that's okay. We'll need to add this code into our configuration of identity. So by default, roles are not managed. Only the identities are managed. So we will go to Startup. And after line 35, we're going to make a call to add roles with the identity role class. So we need to add this code into our configuration of ASP.NET Identity. I might go to my database and delete that customer user and then try it again. Because right now I've got a user account that's not in any role. They're sort of orphaned. They can log in, but they have no, once we start enabling role-based permissions, they won't be able to do anything. So add to the startup file inside of kind of this method chain of adding default identity, make sure we .add roles, identity role, bracket, bracket. Add line 37 to enable role management, not enabled by default. So you may want this comment explaining what we've done here. I'm going to jump back to Management Studio. I'm just going to delete that user account, and then I'll do it again. So I will delete from users where username equals. So I'm going to delete that account. I just highlight that one line, execute it. And now I'm back to a single user. Only my administrators here. Now I'm going to go to Chrome and try it again. So I will register again. So now I'm signed in as customer. I've got 2 users again. And now if I look at my ASP.NET user roles, I should have 2 records here. My first user should be in the role ID of 1, which is administrator. Second user should be role ID of 2, which is customer. So I've got role ID 1 and role ID 2. So now we have the setup that we need. And by default, any other users that we create, they will automatically from now on be in role ID number 2. One of the students in the other classes asked a good question. She said, okay, so you created the administrator first manually, and now we've added the code so that everybody else is a customer, but what happens if we wanted 3 roles? How would you do that? Well, there would be a few options. One option is you could just create somebody in that 3rd role manually. The other option would be to create a page that only an administrator could access, kind of make a copy of this register page, but include on here, include a drop-down list, let's say, or a checkbox list for the various roles you wanted. And the administrator would have to create the accounts and assign a user to a role. So a site like D2L works this way. Right? We can't self-register. We can't choose our own role. There's an administrator at Lakehead who manages the account and assigns those roles. So we would need to create an administrative access only page to do that, if we didn't want people to be able to just register themselves, or we had a more sophisticated list of rules. So I can log in as a customer. Now we can see that our authentication check is not sufficient. Because I can register, anybody can come here and register, log in, and now even though I'm not an administrator, I have access, to manage the product catalog. That'd be nice. Maybe I want to say, hey, okay, I want this book for 1 cent, and then I want to go buy it. So we'll need to change the authentication checks that we did in the first part of class to authorization checks. Just because I've logged in doesn't mean I should be able to administer the product catalog. Yes, I need to be logged in, but I also need to have the right permissions by being a member of the administrator group. So let's go back to our categories controller. And instead of making this all private, making sure they're private, we're going to say accessible to administrators. So I'm going to keep that authorized line on line 15, but we're going to add to it. We're going to set roles equal to administrator. And that's going to be case sensitive. So rule names, case sensitive, must match records UDB. So if I save that change, this should prevent a customer from now accessing the categories controller, with the exception, of course, of our details method, which will allow anybody in. If we were allowing multiple roles, we can just comma separate this list. So if we had like a super administrator, a supplier, a manager, accounting, whatever it was, we just comma separate that list of strings. So the result of this should be, in Firefox, I should still be able to access every method inside of the categories controller. In Chrome, I am logged in, but I'm logged in as a customer. I should not be able to get to anything in categories except for details. Let's test it out. So Firefox, where I'm administrator, I can still create, edit, delete. But in Chrome, I don't have to log in. I'm already logged in, but I don't have access, right? Role-based access control is enabled now. So I automatically get an access denied. Categories, create. Any method in categories, except for details. Details is fine, because it allows anonymous users even. If I click edit though, again, I get access denied. Okay, if you got access denied from your admin account, Quinn, there's two possible problems. Number one is, first of all, check your database. Do you have the roles? And is your first user account in role ID 1? That's the first thing to check. So it's possible something may not have gone quite right when you tried running the script. Maybe you forgot to execute the script, I don't know. So that's number one. Check your roles and your user roles in the database. Second thing is make sure you've spelled administrator correctly in the authorized restriction. If it doesn't match, if this role name doesn't match this role name exactly, you won't have access. You can't see details. Mason, and you've got allow anonymous above the details method? Because anybody should be able to get into details, even an anonymous user. Like if I go, yep. Okay, good to know. So I'm just going to copy the URL, the details. I'll open up a third browser. Right? So here I'm anonymous. I can still go to category details as an anonymous user. So in Edge, I'm not logged in. Quinn, when you run the queries, do you get results like me? And again, just check, make sure you check your spelling here. And that's roles, plural, equals. I may have to look at it after with you. Okay. So now we want to change our if statement in the nav bar as well. We no longer want to just check if the user's identity is authenticated. We want to check if they're in the administrator role. So I'm going to take out that .identity.is authenticated. And instead, our condition for our if statement is going to be different. It's going to be if user dot is in role. And then we provide a string parameter. Again, it's case sensitive, so it has to match exactly. So if our user is in the administrator role, show the categories. So I should see this link in Firefox. I shouldn't see it in Chrome, where I'm a customer. I shouldn't see it in Edge, where I'm anonymous. So we're changing the if statement to now do a role-based authorization check. So in Firefox, I can see my link. In Chrome, where I'm a customer, it's now gone. In Edge, it was never even here. We also want to add the authorization check, however, to the books, because everything in books is still public. So whether I'm anonymous, when I'm a customer, doesn't matter. I can still get anywhere. You haven't done anything to add any security to the books. So let's just repeat this quickly. So what I'll actually do is we really don't need this home link here. Most websites don't have a link that says home. We've already got this bigger, the name of our site that says the last chapter, that goes to the home page. So I'm going to move this link over here. I'm going to rename it to books. And then we're also going to put it inside of our if statement, so only an administrator can see the link. I'm going to take the link that shows up on line 25 to 27. I'm going to drag it down here. So this link goes before the home link went before the categories link. Now we're going to put the categories link first. We're going to put the home link second, but I'm going to change the controller and the link text from home. I'm going to change the word home in both places to books. So now our administrator will see the last chapter categories, books. Customers and anonymous users are only going to see the last chapter link at the top left. They will not see either of these. And then we'll need to actually control access. Just hiding the link isn't enough. We actually will need to put the security check in the books controller as well. We'll secure it, so you must be an administrator to access any method anywhere in the books controller. So as a Firefox user and an administrator, I can go home, categories, books. In Chrome, I only see the link home. And in Edge, same, I only see the link home. So we now just need one line of code in the books controller, because right now everything's public by default. We want to control access to the books controller for administrators only. So the same security check we have here on line 15, we're going to add that to the books controller as well. We're going to open up the books controller. So we're going to, again, authorize that only users in the administrator role can get here. And we'll just, again, make the same reference that we did in the categories controller to Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authorization. So our reference gets added here on line 6. So now customers and the anonymous users, okay, no problem, that's good, Quinn. I'm rather glad it's working for you. Never apologize that something is working. Okay. So I still have access now as an administrative user, but as a customer, we get access denied. We get 3 different outputs here. As an anonymous user, I get asked to log in. So that's our role-based access control in action. When we have permissions, we can access the resource. When we are authenticated, but we don't have sufficient permissions to a specific resource, we get access denied. And when we're not even authenticated, we just get bounced to the login screen. So we've now implemented, with very little code, we've now implemented this authorization model. So we had to do a little configuring in the database. We did have to configure our application on startup for role management. And then we simply used the authorization library in .NET Core to enable role-based access control. Does anybody have questions about any of the authentication or authorization implementation that we've been working on? We have done most of what we wanted to do today with identity. We'll do some more with this after reading week in terms of enabling third-party authentication We'll try maybe Google and Microsoft. Megan, I'm not sure what those fields are for. The normalized name, I've never used them. So I couldn't actually tell you the purpose of those fields and why they are in all caps. Those columns that column didn't used to be part of the role table. Microsoft added it a few years ago. I've never used it, so I'm not sure why, to be honest with you. I'll have to do a bit of reading and see if I can find out. I do want to spend just a few more minutes starting to set up. We've kind of made the site now where there's really nothing here for anybody but the administrator to do. Right? As an anonymous user, I can't really see or do anything. And as a customer, same, I can't really see or do anything. So let's quickly just start. We're going to make one controller, an empty controller, and one view. We kind of want to make the first part of our shopping experience that kind of looks like this. It won't take us very long, and then we will call it a day. So I'm going to go over to my controllers, and I'm going to add controller. We are not scaffolding with views using Entity Framework. This is going to be a custom controller for the shopping part of the website. So it's not just simple create, read, update, delete. So I'm going to pick an empty controller and click add. The name will be shop controller. So this is not mapped directly to a table the way the categories or books controllers are. I'm going to call it shop controller because I want the URL to be localhost/shop, which is a nice descriptive URL for that workflow of the app. So call it shop controller. And it's going to give us an empty index view. We can go ahead and create a simple view. If I just right click my method name, I'll choose add a view. And we'll just pick an empty view. We'll just write the code on here ourselves. We're not going to scaffold out an HTML table. Just pick an empty view and accept the default name, which is going to be index. So I'll just click enter. We get an empty page. We'll put on maybe an H1 to shop our store. And we can put on a page title. We're almost done, folks. Bear with me. So we'll set our title property also to shop our store. So I'll build the site, and we should now be able to browse to our localhost/shop. And it will load this page in the browser. Build. I think I'll go in, do it in Chrome. So when I go to localhost/shop, gives me this page. So we want to now use a query in this controller method that fetches the list of categories, and then we want to display them in a loop in the view using Bootstrap card style. And then we'll just put a link in the nav bar that's public so anybody can start to shop. So you go back to the controller. Now we're going to need to use our database in this controller, which means we'll need to add a bit of stuff here. When we scaffolded, so here's our books controller. it automatically creates a database connection object, an instance of application DB context, and then we've got a constructor that when our controller gets instantiated, it automatically is using our database connection. So we're going to need similar code in our custom controller. So this will be our class level DB context connection objects. So we'll declare this variable, and we'll need to add a reference because Visual Studio, the controller doesn't know what application DB context is. So we'll just make a reference to the data namespace. Constructor accepts DB context instance. So whenever you call the constructor, you've got to give this class a database connection. So then we're just going to assign that database connection to our variable up here. So this way we can use this context variable in all the methods. So again, this code, when we scaffold the controller, the code's already here. If we're going to build our own controller, we will need to handle the database connection manually. So then we want to query the list of categories for display. So we'll use our database connection, our categories DB set. We're going to sort the list of categories alphabetically in our query. And we'll just convert that query result to a list. And that list will support the IEnumerable so we can iterate or loop through it. Z order. And then when we load the view, we're going to send that data to the view. So we're declaring a database connection. We're instantiating it when our controller is instantiated. And then we're using that connection to query the database in order by name. We're going to send that query result to the browser. We now need to add a loop in our view, our index view, where we can output and display each category. And then we'll just throw a simple shop link in the nav bar, call it a day. I'll leave this code up here for a minute. And again, we'll need, in order to make this work, we'll accept the reference to our data namespace. Because our database connection, it lives inside of the data folder. We'll go back to the index view. We'll need a few lines here to build this page. We'll declare a model, type IEnumerable. So our page receives a list of category objects from the controller. So we use row card group. This will be our container. And then we'll use a loop to output each category. So for each category in our data model, so we want to print 3 categories in a row. So I'll use some bootstrap formatting. And a card class. We'll center the text and make them 100 pixels high, each card. And here we can just print out the category name. So this should give us cards 3 per row with a box that's 100 pixels high and the category name right in the middle of it. Let's see how this looks. Helps if I save my file. So now we get a box at full scale. It's 3 across the screen. Smaller width, it's 2 or even 1. And I also want to make these links so the user can actually click on any one of them. So I'm going to wrap this in an anchor, our controller. Again, our controller is shop. Our action is going to be shop by category. We'll create that later. And we'll pass in an ID here. Of at c.category ID. So now those category names, they're also links. So instead of just the category names being printed as HTML where the user can't do anything, they can click one. It's going to call shop by category and it's going to pass in the ID. So when we continue on with our shopping cart in lesson 8, we can then show all the books in the selected category. So now they're links. I click on something, it says shop, shop by category, passes in the ID. So my final step is just going to be to put a link in the nav bar that says shop. That link will be public. Anybody can go to the shop. They don't have to log in. They'll have to log in to check out. They don't have to log in to browse the store, put items in their cart. So I'll leave this code up for just a moment. I'll put it all on GitHub in a minute anyway. Don't panic if you're a bit behind. So I'm going to put a shop link in the navigation bar on our layout file. That's our last act for today. I'll put it above the administrator links here. So our ASP controller will be shop, and our ASP action will be index. The link will say shop. So that's now going to be the first link in the nav bar beside the site name. link to the last chapter that'll go to the site homepage, a link to the shop that's public, and then administrators will also get categories and books links. So I've added lines 25, 26, 27. So now I see shop first. When I'm an admin user, as a customer, I just see shop. In Edge, as an anonymous user, I also just see shop. But I can still get here, it's public. So most of the things in the shopping controller will be public until we get to checkout and payment. Those methods will be private. So that's fine, we get a 404. That's okay. I'm going to put everything up on GitHub. Be uploading the videos a bit later. Are there any questions before we wrap up for the day and leading into reading week? So we do not have a class next week. Okay, not seeing questions in the chat. So I'm going to stop our recording. I will get your assignments marked, certainly by early next week, if not sooner. I may have a chance to do it before then. You do have a quiz. It is due next Monday, so you do have a quiz based on the authentication concepts we talked about today. So you just have a week to do it, and then nothing else over reading week. So when we come back, we're going to implement Google and Microsoft authentication in our application. And we will also take a look at assignment 3 when we come back. Okay, have a great reading week. Enjoy your week off, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks.